All right, it's a little after 7. We're going to get started. My name is Dr. Dama Brown Hathaway, and I will be the moderator tonight for the town hall. For those of you just joining us, again, we'd love it if you could just in the chat tell us your name, your preferred pronouns, your church location, and just what makes you feel most alive about church. And so just to tell everybody just a little bit about why we are here. This is part of one of the many activities that the Open Spirit Task Force is involved in. As many of you know, there was a special call session of General Conference back in February of this year. And the outcome of that essentially affirmed the UMC's ban on the ordination of LGBT clergy and also a ban on officiating same-sex weddings. And, you know, these bans are harmful to many clergy and lay persons here in the New England Annual Conference. And now we see that coming January 1st, 2020, the measures are going to be more punitive for those who defy what is currently set forth. And so this town hall is a way for us to talk more about some of the concerns that clergy and laity have, and also to talk more about what's going on around the various annual conferences, and also in some of the legislative solutions that are coming out for General Conference 2020. Before we delve more deeply into our conversation tonight, one thing I would like to do is just to start with prayer. And so I would like to ask everyone to assume a posture of prayer and to follow along, if you will, with the prayer that appears on our screen. Eternal One, at this time of uncertainty, divided views, and confusion, remind us that you have been here before us, suffering, caring, bringing together a small voice for hope that under us all, under all in anxiety, are your everlasting arms, your perfect love. Amen. And also before we delve a little bit deeper, I just want to say what our guidelines are tonight. We call this a town hall, but I want to say that it's really stressed that this is more about sharing information about the task force, sharing information about what's going on in our annual conference and beyond, and also sharing more about some of the legislation that's coming forth in terms of General Conference 2020. But just a couple of guidelines here. Each of our panelists will have 12 minutes to present, but I think we're going to give the panelists a little bit more time, given just the information and the context of what they would like to share. After a certain point, I will let the panelists know when they have like 2 minutes remaining, and we'll have questions for the panelists, but we won't do that till after each panelist has actually presented. One thing I would like people to do throughout the presentations is to use the chat feature to ask questions. And at the end of, after our final panelist, we'll open up for discussion, and we'll allow for questions to be raised and allow the panelists to respond.
I don't want to interrupt, but there's a fair amount of background noise. If I could request non-speakers to go on mute and speakers to avoid.
And I've already pretty much said this already, but the topics to be addressed tonight, first, to talk a little bit about the Open Spirit Task Force, provide some updates in terms of where we are as a task force. We'll also hear from the New England discerners. We'll also hear some of the responses and models for action that have occurred and that are in process since General Conference 2019. And then we'll also hear an overview of the proposed General Conference 2020 legislation. So the Open Spirit Task Force, who are we? What is it? The Open Spirit Task Force was created because of a resolution that was passed at this most recent annual conference. And essentially our charge is to examine whether or how United Methodists of New England might align with, create, or form a new church body in the Methodist tradition, either independently or in collaboration with others. And over the next couple of slides, you'll see some information about those who are part of the task force, our co-chairs and our members. I'm not going to belabor this too much, but I will say that the task force is chaired by Reverend Dr. Hope Lucky, who currently is an ordained elder and lead pastor at Crawford Memorial United Methodist Church in Winchester, and also by myself. I'm Adama Brown Hathaway. I'm the Minister of Connection and Care at Union Church in Boston, and also certified candidate here in the New England Annual Conference on the Deacon track. And the task force, we're essentially comprised of 5 teams. We have a steering team, and we also have our communications team, which will plays a key role in getting educational information out, or will play a role in that, and also some of our other communications that you may have seen in the Catalyst. We also have our legal, ethical, structural team that looks more at some of the legal and ethical issues that may arise in terms of creating something new or aligning with a new expression of Methodism. We also have a finance team that's looking at the financial implications of creating something new. We also have our options and organization team that's looking at the various options that are available or may be available for us to consider. And then our theology and spirituality team is really grounding everything in more of a Wesleyan theology, and assuring that as we move forward, that we move forward in a way that is very theologically sound. And we also have enlisted the help of a number of consultants. They're listed here on the screen. Many of them are retired clergy. We've had some input from professors from the Boston University School of Theology. And we've also had a couple of lay persons who have provided some wisdom and insight as we have moved through this process. Tonight, we're going to have 4 panelists. I've already started to do an update. The other panelists will have Reverend Will Green, who is the pastor at Brackett Memorial United Methodist Church in Peaks Island, Maine. He'll talk more about the New England discerners and the churches who are discerning whether or not to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. We'll also hear from Reverend Catherine Johnson, who is the lead pastor at Parkway United Methodist Church in Milton, Massachusetts, who will talk about the many activities that are going on at other annual conferences throughout the United Methodist Church. And then finally, we'll hear from Reverend Becca Garrell, who's the lead pastor at Lebanon United Methodist Church, who'll talk more about the General Conference 2020 legislation that has been proposed. So the Open Spirit Task Force, these next 2 slides just tell us more about the work of the task force. Essentially, we are doing or have been doing our work kind of in 3 phases, and we're currently in phase 1 of our work. We started back in August of this year. There are approximately 33 members of the task force, primarily clergy from throughout the annual conference. We have 3 advisors who work with us. I've already indicated how we are divided or comprised of 5 sub-teams as well as a steering team. Over the course of the last couple of months, those teams have really engaged in a lot of conversation and shared resources. We have a website that where we share some of the updates for those teams and other resources that we think might be available or interesting and helpful to those in the annual conference who are trying to make rhyme or reason in terms of what is going on. Last month, we continue to have conversations and get input from our consultants. And we also ask the teams to prepare or to begin preparing what they view as the essentials and non-negotiables that they are starting to derive or arrive at, given all the information that they're gathering and the reading and the conversations that they're having. We're also trying not to work in a silo or in silos. So we have asked, or we started to ask individuals from various churches in the form of focus groups to give us some input about their values, their church values, about what they would like to see in a new expression of Methodism. And we're also asking them, what are their hopes and dreams for the future? Again, to kind of get some information and input from throughout the annual conference so that we're not working in silos and that we can also kind of hold the feedback and the interest of the annual conference while we're at the same time looking at all this information that is before us. Now we're in the midst of a town hall, and we're also starting to prepare for a retreat that will take place in January. This is not going to be a retreat where we're going to like just sit back and drink hot cocoa or anything like that. This is going to be some real tough, hard work where the task force, as well as our delegation to General Conference and Jurisdictional Conference, will really get together and look at all the information and data that has been collected from the various sub-teams of the task force, and really start to try to make some recommendations that we can put forth to the bishop, to the cabinet, and to the rest of the annual conference as to how we should move forward together in 2020. Phase 2 of that plan, which I pretty much already talked about, involves the retreat that's coming up. And that's in process. We're still planning it and working with our consultants, our facilitators for that retreat. In February, we hope that we'll have some recommendations that we can present to the annual conference. We hope to have created some educational strategies and materials that we can begin to share with throughout the annual conference that churches can use to think about how we continue to go forward in 2020. One way that we hope to get this information out and that we're talking about doing is to have some district meetings for all the 9 districts throughout the annual conference as a way to, again, share the recommendations and share the work of the task force, the joint work of the task force and the delegation. And also with phase 3, we'll move toward doing more district meetings. We hope to do another town hall to share where we are as a task force. And then in May, that's when General Conference takes place, and we'll have a town hall debrief around General Conference 2020. And so that's the work of the task force at hand, and you'll have a chance to ask more questions towards the end. Now would like to turn it over to Reverend Will Green. Reverend Will Green has been so instrumental in the work and the fight for full inclusion for a number of years. He currently is the pastor of one of the churches that is discerning the direction that they will go in 2020. I'm delighted that he was willing to be a part of this tonight. So let's turn it over to Will Green so he can give us an update on the New England Discerners.
Thank you so much. That's really kind. I appreciate that introduction. And we all appreciate your work, Dr. Brown Hathaway, and everybody else on the team who is working on the Open Spirit Task Force.
For some reason, I'm not able to hear you.
You're really missing out. Okay, let's see. Can you hear what I'm saying now? I'm unmuted.
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. I see in the chat someone else saying they can hear me, so maybe I'll keep going. Okay. Great. Thank you was the first thing I was saying. I really appreciate the introduction and all the work that everyone's doing. So what I'm going to do is share a little bit about the background of the project I'm working on, what we're actually doing, and then some reflection on how it's going, this New England Discerners thing. So background. General Conference passed a piece of legislation that provides a new way for congregations to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. Disaffiliate meaning to leave the United Methodist Church. So a local church, a congregation, can go through this process that was approved at General Conference. And what's special about this process that was approved, it's now in effect in called paragraph 2553. What's special about this process for congregations leaving the United Methodist Church is that it allows local churches to leave the denomination with their assets, with properties that they own, so the church building, the parsonage, and with financial assets like bank accounts and investment funds. As people probably know, local churches hold property and financial assets in trust, and are not the owners of that process, of that stuff. But this paragraph 2553 creates a process by which churches can leave and keep that stuff. Another way to say this is that this paragraph suspends the trust clause, the clause of the Book of Discipline that says that local churches hold property in trust for the denomination. In addition to the General Conference passing paragraph 2553, our annual conference, the New England Annual Conference, at our last meeting passed a resolution that put some additional requirements in place for congregations that are leaving, for congregations leaving the denomination. So that's Resolution 211 that you can read from our most recent annual conference. And it does a few things. It requires churches to go through an 8-month discernment process. And it also requires congregations to be in communication with several annual conference bodies, such as conference trustees and Board of Congregational Development. It also requires congregations to have a number of listening sessions chaired by the district superintendent or their representative, and then to write some things as an outcome of those listening sessions with the district superintendents. 9 churches in the New England Annual Conference started meeting, or I should say representatives from 9 congregations started meeting in April, and so this is before annual conference, and after annual conference in the early summer, we decided together that we'd like to see if our congregations are interested in starting this 8-month discernment process that's required by Resolution 211. We might have started with more or less than 9, but it ended up that there were 9 churches that did decide as of September 26th of this year that we were starting a discernment process. And the Resolution 211 doesn't spell out what the 8-month discernment process is. It just says there has to be an 8-month discernment process. So we created an 8-month discernment process. And what we decided on is that each of our churches is going to have and is now having a monthly meeting once a month over the course of 8 months, where we get together to talk about what we are learning and deciding and the questions we have around disaffiliating from the United Methodist Church. So basically, it's a monthly congregational meeting where we check in about where we are with our decision-making, the questions we have around what it means to leave the United Methodist Church. So we have a really simple outline, a really simple curriculum of 8 meetings. I'll go through that briefly. Our first meeting in each congregation. So these congregations are going through this process separately. The church I serve is going through it on our own, but there's a weekly check-in where representatives from each church are on a Zoom call, and we talk about how it's going, what we're learning, whatever is surfacing, questions, support, that sort of stuff. So we're not doing this as 9 churches making one decision together. We're doing it as individual groups. Okay, so the 8 discernment sessions. The first one was just on UMC 101, polity, what's general conference, what's annual conference, what's the book of discipline, who's the bishop, this sort of 101 stuff, which, as we all know, lots of people in our local churches have questions around that. Our second session is framed around this question of what it means to be a Methodist today, looking at the life, the spirituality, the religious traditions of Methodism and Wesleyan Christianity. So this is kind of like a membership class so far, these first two. The third session is using the theological framing of a group called Forward, which I hope people know of and have been reading about. Forward is a group that brings a liberationist lens to the United Methodist Church and to the practice of Christianity. So this is looking at what it means to seek liberation that centers and empowers people of color, queer people, trans people. How does the concept of liberation different from the concept of inclusion? These sorts of questions. So that's the third session. What does liberation mean for us? These are, I think, all predominantly white congregations in this process. How is racism related to our work together, to our vision for the church, to who we are? Fourth session has to do with clergy. We're going to be talking about, if a church is to leave the denomination, who would serve as clergy? Would these congregations have clergy? What would credentialing look like, since that comes through United Methodist Church? And then our last few sessions, since I'm almost at 8 minutes, we're going to give updates on correspondence from the conference bodies that we need to dialogue with per Resolution 211. We're going to have a meeting just about financial options. How much is this going to cost? And then we're going to have a meeting. The seventh meeting will be pre-general conference, and the final one will be post-general conference. At that point, we will have completed an 8-month process of discernment, and we will be able to vote. Now, we won't have to vote at that time, or I shouldn't say vote, to make a decision about whether or not we could, might not vote. We might use some other decision-making process to articulate what our intentions are. And that will be before annual conference of this year. Let's see, I want to say, as far as reflection and how it's going, that it's fantastic. This process is incredibly empowering and helpful, and is answering lots of questions for the people in our local churches. Two parts of this: we're having very good, deliberate internal questions within the congregation once a month. Just space for us to get together and ask, I don't know, about things that are changing. What do the recent Judicial Council rulings have to do with us? Or what's the Judicial Council might be a good question. Or just where we are on our decision-making process as far as what our hopes are, what our dreams are, what's inspiring us, what vision we're moving towards. And of course, part of that also is what our fears are and, how we're reflecting. So there's the internal piece, but there's also external reflecting, because there are other church, we're not alone. We're very much aware that we are not alone. We're building very strong connections within the, across these congregations from one to another. So it's not like, what's happening in the United Methodist Church, how do we keep track of it? But more, what's the community that we're developing, learning and feeling and thinking. Also, personally, it's just good to have, both within my local church setting and within these weekly calls, it's really great to be able to do processing and to reflect, because this is wicked hard. It's very emotional. It's super sad. I mean, it's sad to be a queer person in the United Methodist Church, period, but also it's hard to be a United Methodist right now, and for some time. So it's good to be able to reflect on that and talk about that. I'm at 10 minutes. Some feedback, other feedback about how it's going. It's been, we haven't been able to get, to have helpful communication yet with the conference bodies that we're required to be in communication with. We wrote to everybody on September 26th, but the groups that we were required to write to by this resolution, as they said at annual conference when this was presented, don't know the answers to the questions. It's not that we're being avoided, it's that people really don't know how much it's going to cost. What are the trusts, what are the trustees' options? So I doubt that, you know, over the course of Christmas, that all of these answers are going to become crystal clear, and that in early January we'll have answers to all of these things. So again, it's good that we're, you know, forcing this conversation and going down this path, because it's a lot of work for a lot of people to figure out what the options are. I guess last thing I want to say is that I would encourage every congregation in the New England Annual Conference to have deliberate conversations about whether or not you want to continue being a part of the United Methodist Church and what that would mean. This is a really good opportunity to do the work. You know, you might be clear that you're not leaving the United Methodist Church either as a lay person, as a clergy person, or even as a congregation. But, you know, there's the possibility that the United Methodist Church might not be there within the next couple months. So you want to have conversations now and prepare to have these deep sort of conversations. There's really no reason not to be talking about this stuff. 12 minutes says my stopwatch, so I'll stop.
Was there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I just wanted to have it be exactly 12 minutes. I'm that kind of person.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Will. And just a reminder to everyone, first of all, this is being recorded so that you'll be able to go back and listen to and look at this town hall. It also will be posted on the Open Spirit Task Force website probably tomorrow, before the end of the week. So it'll be available. So just want to remind people of that. And also, if you have any questions that you would like to direct to Will, that you can use the chat function and you can post a question, and then we'll raise those questions at the end of the session.
Read Becca's statement. Becca wrote something.
Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical issue there. I want to go on and move on to the next panelist. Reverend Catherine Johnson has spent a lot of time being an advocate for social justice. She was the former executive director of MFSA, and she now serves Parkway United Methodist Church in Milton, Massachusetts. And tonight she'll talk more about the various responses and models for action that have occurred and that are occurring since General Conference 2019.
Thanks, Adama. Can folks hear me? I hope. Great. So I'm going to talk about 4 different areas of things tonight, starting with a reality check about where we are right now, a brief look at the immediate aftermath, the weeks and months following General Conference 2019, and then look at 4 different models, ways in which people are responding to what has happened, and then finally share a few observations. So in terms of the reality check, Adama spoke earlier about the restrictions that were put in place in 2019. I think it's important to remember just how horrible those restrictions are. I went back to read through the list and pulled just a few to remind ourselves that what is about to become United Methodist policy includes an expanded definition of self-avowed practicing homosexual, a structure to hold bishops accountable for their actions related to LGBT justice, penalties, minimum penalties for clergy who perform same-sex weddings, 1 year suspension without pay for a first offense, and then loss of credentials for a second. General Counsel on Finance and Administration withholding funds from annual conferences that don't give a litmus test to candidates regarding homosexuality before agreeing to ordain them. And bishops no longer being able to dismiss complaints without reasons given. And those are just some of the restrictions. But this is what was known as the traditional plan. That becomes United Methodist policy in 43 days. So in other words, on January 1st, this is us. All those restrictions are who we are. So the next slide, yeah, in terms of the response to what was passed at GC 2019, those who had been advocating for these changes for decades actually believed that those restrictions were long overdue, and they are delighted that they were passed at that time. Others were, of course, dismayed and devastated. Do the next slide. I've just captured some pictures here. This is a picture of young adults at General Conference 2019 at the microphone addressing the traditional plan at that point. And then in the next slide, I've just grabbed some pictures from my photo records over the years. And it's just so devastating to capture the faces, particularly of young people, but not just young people. These pictures were all taken as restrictive legislation was being passed. And you can just see the agony on people's faces. And sadly, I have many, many more of these pictures. So those around the country, dismayed, devastated, and many people just stunned. In response to what happened, as I reviewed for tonight's presentation, what struck me was that there were an incredible number of words written, church signs, newspaper ads, declarations, letters, statements, petitions, online, e-newsletters, coming from every direction. Words, 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 words. There were lots of excellent proclamations and statements, more things for people to sign. This is the slide we have up now, is our cabinet responding to what happened. But a lot of what happened were, it was words, lots and lots of words. In the midst of that, it's really important to remember that the human toll continues. As clergy leave and or are forced out of the denomination and live in the tremendous tension, feeling targeted and unsafe. And then again, particularly young people questioning their worth and value as children of God, and deeming the United Methodist Church a hostile environment to themselves and their LGBTQ friends. So people continue to pay the price, even as we're trying to figure out what to do with the future. More recently, an interesting response from some bishops who have stated an action step that they plan to take come January 1st. And that is a statement that they will not comply with the new restrictions. This, in particular, the bishops of the Western jurisdiction, probably most of you have seen the videotape that they produced at the last Council of Bishops meeting, saying that they will not comply. And two individual bishops have made similar statements that I'm aware of. There may be more. Bishop John Scholl of Greater New Jersey and Bishop Sally Dick of Northern Illinois. The quote that I saw from Bishop Dick was, "I will not facilitate or move on trial complaints against LGBTQ clergy or clergy who perform same-gender weddings." So this is an interesting step. As we know, Many bishops have worked behind the scenes, but to have bishops stepping out publicly and saying that they will not comply with the new restrictions is an interesting step. Also, churches across the country, I don't know about outside of the US, there are not paying their apportionments. There's a real dip in payment of apportionments. I don't know if there's any way to know how much of this is due to it being done as a statement of conscience, and how much is just that it's hard to pay apportionments, and with everything that's going on, churches are choosing to not pay their apportionments in full. But we're seeing the impact of this throughout the church. The year hasn't ended yet, so we don't know how it'll end up, but there's been a real dip in apportionments. Another response has to do with churches leaving the denomination. And here, Will has talked about churches that are preparing to leave the denomination or deciding whether they'll choose to disaffiliate. In the meantime, a number of churches actually are using the new provision in church law to go ahead and leave. The place that I'm most aware of is Mississippi, where last June, I think it was 7 churches disaffiliated. And I've got New England Discerners up here. Actually, that's 9 churches is exploring the possibility. Ocean City Church in Cal, Nevada just took a vote to disaffiliate, but hasn't asked the annual conference to vote yet. And I'm sure this is happening all over the place, these conversations. There's really no way to track that. But some churches are taking that action and are disaffiliating. One thing Will didn't mention is that the provision in the discipline for disaffiliating, I believe, unless it's been changed, is a window to be able to do that. It's for a certain period of time. That may be changed, I don't know. But for now, I think that window is up until December of 2023, that churches can choose to disaffiliate and go through those various steps. But it has to be a matter of conscience. You can't just disaffiliate because you're tired of the Methodist Church. That action needs to be taken either because of the restrictions that have been put in place, or in some cases, people disaffiliating because their annual conferences aren't following restrictions in the discipline. So at both ends of the spectrum. So lots of churches, like the churches in our discerners group, are trying to figure out what to do, having conversations, studying together, trying to figure out next steps. So as to models of response, I've picked out 4. There's probably lots more, but these models kind of stood out to me. One being an annual conference model, one jurisdictional, one setting up a structure for a separate denomination, and then the 4th, an invitation into a new way of being church. So the first one, the annual conference model, the clearest example I've seen of this is what Greater New Jersey has done. They have had 2 special sessions of annual conference in addition to their regular session of annual conference. They began right after General Conference last year, formed a way forward team, held listening posts around the annual conference, did an online survey, gathered information, and the conclusions that they came to were that they want to remain united as an annual conference, want people to be able to live their convictions within that united annual conference, want to continue their mission, ministry, and service. And this one is an interesting one. They want support from an outside facilitator to assist conversations about human sexuality within their congregation. That was particularly interesting. Let's see, the next slide, they have adopted a process for creating covenants within churches. It's not mandatory, but churches are invited to do this. So churches that want to move forward with ministry that affirms full participation of LGBTQ plus persons, congregations can develop covenants to that effect, or covenants that affirm other convictions and beliefs. The annual conference is training facilitators to work with churches to develop those covenants. So I guess, I don't know, I haven't talked to people there, that this might be similar to what Will was talking about holding conversations at the local church level about who they are, what their ministry is about, and forming a covenant around that. The covenants are voluntary. At the end of October, which is when they had their last special session of annual conference, 64 churches had signed up. With this model, I just want to give one word of caution. Bishop John Scholl, who's the bishop of the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference, a few general conferences ago, when there was deep, deep division at General Conference, he and others came together to vote, to write and state for the General Conference a statement of unity. So my word of caution is just, we were deeply divided at that General Conference, and yet he was presenting this statement of unity. So I just have a little bit of, I'm a little bit worried about a statement about their wanting to remain united. I'm wondering what the minority voices are within the annual conference around that. I know that some folks on the conservative end of the spectrum have already challenged the legality of what they're doing. And then the second thing, obviously, is this is all in contradiction to what's going into effect January 1st. So I don't know what's going to happen with that, but it's an interesting model where they've really pulled together as an annual conference. A second model I've called jurisdictional model. The Western jurisdiction has, I'm hearing something. Am I out of time? Oh, shoot, I'm way over. Okay, jurisdictional model, Western jurisdiction since General Conference worked together right off the bat, stated at General Conference that they would continue to be a home for all God's people. The bishops, I just said, gave this safe harbor declaration. They've just had a jurisdictional gathering, visioning for the future. Each of the annual conferences is doing interesting kinds of visioning, and a group call of delegates under the name of All Belong in the Body of Christ has submitted legislation. It appears in looking at all of this that this, again, is all projected kind of visioning. I don't see concrete action here as much as in the New Jersey Annual Conference model. The third model, this is the Wesleyan Covenant Association. They have set up an alternative structure. They're ready to go with the new structure. Starting in 1966, they have put together structures for doctrine, publishing, mission, women's work, political advocacy, and more recently, they're ready to start a new church. So they have done this simultaneously with trying to gain control of the resources of the denomination. But they just held a global gathering. They declared that the breakup of UMC is inevitable. They've endorsed the Indianapolis Plan for Amicable Separation and have received a new book of doctrines and discipline. So they're ready to go with a new church structure that they will implement at the close of General Conference if things don't go the way that 2020, the way that they would like. Then the fourth model, invitation to a new way of being church, put forward by UM Forward. Will talked about this a bit. A church that is theologically prophetic, understands justice as intersectional, centers those on the margins, understands church as mutually connected and interdependent, creates beloved community inspired by grace, resurrection, hope, and gospel liberation. thing I really want to say about this, the reason I pulled this as a separate model, is that what is different about this from all of the other models out there is that this contains a critique and analysis of the ways in which our current denomination enables and furthers structures of white privilege, racism, sexism, homophobia, and perhaps most importantly, imperialism. So it acknowledges that we are holding together people not just with different opinions, but totally different understandings of what it means to be church. This couple of milestones here, there was a gathering in Minnesota last May, and there's another gathering coming up in next month. And the legislation that this group has put forward is the New Expressions Worldwide Plan. So finally, couple observations. We have an incredible need for discussion and study at the local church level. As Will mentioned, we're just discovering that conversations around sexuality, white privilege, interconnected justice issues, our local church folks aren't talking about that stuff, and there's a tremendous need for that. The next thing Will mentioned, lack of understanding about the global scope of the church and structure of the church. Need for people to understand that so they understand how decisions are being made. And then finally, just a couple things that I would commend to people. One of them is the book, The Death of White Christian America by Robert Jones. Very important, I believe, in understanding where we currently are as the United Methodist Church. And then secondly, I would recommend viewing a 15-minute video by scholar Daryl Stevens that he gave as part of the Post-Way Forward gathering of scholars. And that's easy to Google and pull up. And some of you on the call were present at our district day on Saturday, and will have heard Diana Butler-Bass, who told us after a fabulous day that she believes that United Methodists are being given a new opportunity by God. And she said something to the effect of, let's pray we get a closer approximation to getting it right this time. And I felt that was just a very hopeful word as she left us with that thought of this new opportunity in the midst of all the stuff that's happening, that we have a new opportunity that God has given us at this point in history. So that's it. Sorry, I went over.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I actually, I knew that you would have a lot to share, some very rich information. So extended that time for you.
Thank you.
So,
Thank
not
you.
a problem. Hope everybody was able to learn more through your discussion, through your sharing. So let's move forward now to talk about the proposed legislation that's going to come up during General Conference 2020. I've asked Reverend Becca Garrell to provide that overview for us. I have a lot of respect for her. She's an amazing, has amazing command of church polity. So I'll look forward to what she has to share this evening.
Well, thank you, Adama. Am I on? Can't tell if anyone can hear me. Okay. All right. I can't hear myself. So that's, yeah, that's all right. It's disorienting for a second there. Okay. So I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what we've already heard, but there is a fair amount of overlap in the information. What I'm trying to do is to sort through the information that's in front of us. So I want us to keep in mind that we still don't know all of what's been proposed. The legislation won't be out in a form that we can read it for another month or two at least. But we're seeing some of what people are willing to share that they've put forward. And that's how we're able to know what is on the table so far. But we also, what we do know for sure is that everything that comes to General Conference is debated in committee, amended, redebated, minority reports, all kinds of things. So we have no idea what form it will actually take. So there's a sense of not wanting to go too far down any particular rabbit hole, because that's just going to be absorbing so much information that ends up not being helpful. So my goal is to try to help people learn as much as we can about what's happening and what could happen without overwhelming ourselves. And then to prepare for and plan for many options and strategies, work multiple strategies at once. This is, I think, as Catherine was mentioning, the strategy that's been employed by the more conservative parts of our church that work to pass the traditional plan and to prepare another denomination to separate into at the same time. And we're successful, really, in both of those efforts at the same time. And so we and I'm speaking unabashedly as somebody who is working for a just and liberated denomination or denominations. But I believe that we need to be working multiple strategies at once, and we need to do, as my mom would say, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. So what kinds of strategies are out there? You've heard about some of these things already, and I'm just going to break them out into slightly different categories. And again, my focus is not on what kind of church we end up in. This focus, the legislation question, really has to step back first and ask, how do we get out of the church, the denomination, the deadlock that we are in now? Because in order to live into something new, we have to find a way of exiting where we are. And there are legal logistical problems to that. So there are kind of two big ways to do this, and then a kind of miscellaneous category. One way is as a group of plans that try to keep the United Methodist Church as we know it or knew it, but roll back the injustices and the changes of the traditional plan, or inject a little more justice into the church in various ways, but basically keep that structure that's in our polity right now. There's many plans that fall under the category of dividing the denomination into two or more subsequent denominations, or expressions, as many folks are calling them, that would have freedom and autonomy from one another, but might still have some relationship, some full communion, or some ability to work together to share best path benefits or global mission, for example. And then there's some kind of other ideas that don't fit into those two categories. So I'll talk just a little bit about those. Plans that preserve the structure of the United Methodist Church as it is are mostly offered by entities that are already parts of the United Methodist Church. It kind of makes sense. The UMC Next plan, which is offered by a very centrist group of the church, sort of allows traditionalist churches an exit ramp to move into the Wesleyan Covenant Association new denomination if they wish, and then reforms the existing or remaining Methodist Church to be closer to what perhaps folk remember it as being, a sort of centrist, inclusive denomination. An official body within the United Methodist Church is proposing that the United States become its own regional conference or central conference, which would give the United States as a body the ability to make some decisions specific to the United States. Then there's some question about how many decisions, what's included in that. Does that bring enough liberation to any part of the church, but still then remain within the United Methodist Church? The All Belong in the Body of Christ package of legislation coming out of the Western jurisdiction and its delegation offers a really beautiful vision of the church, but really is a package of legislation to just revote and undo the votes of the traditional plan, and include some constitutional amendments for greater inclusivity. I think it's beautifully intentioned, and I think it has very little chance of passing and of creating a new structure of any kind that would bring liberation. At this point, I think we need to be thinking about how we move out of the structure as it is, which I just don't think is going to allow for the kind of freedom from and to one another. So all of these structures have this problem of, can we get the votes to pass them? and will what results be at this point just enough, liberative enough for where a large portion of our annual conference really hopes to go. As a queer person, do I think it's liberative enough for where I would want to see it go? Another group of legislation, and there's in this category too many to really get into each one, but they seek to divide the denomination that we have currently into 2 or more. So you'll hear names like the Indianapolis Plan, the Bard-Jones Plan, the new plan, New Expressions Worldwide, which is the Movement Forward plan that both Will and Catherine mentioned, and a number of others. And these plans differ basically in the how of what they're trying to accomplish. How many new denominations are formed? 2, 3, 4. How are the assets and liabilities divided? And what's the process to ensure fairness and justice in those divisions? Challenges to these plans then are in that category of what is fair, what is just, really trying to look at who was at the table in the preparation and creation of these plans. Where are the voices of people of color, of queer people, of trans people in the conversation, which of course points to the new plan. Where are the voices of conservatives in the congregation or in the conversation? Which points more toward something like the Indianapolis Plan, but might indicate then that there's a more broad-based support. So, but who gets to determine what is fair, and then do we have resulting denominations that can survive and thrive and have a ministry that is able to make an impact in the world and transform lives through the power of the Spirit, which is kind of where we need to get back to? And how long will it take? Some of these have a 2-year timeline, a 4-year, 8-year, how long are we going to be playing this out? More conversations and deliberations, but they're all kind of in that category. Other ideas include things like using the power that is in the jurisdiction, that's the region. In the United States, there are 5 jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions set the boundaries of the annual conferences. And so to create new annual conferences or divide and redraw the boundaries of annual conferences, and then potentially separate those annual conferences one from another, so that every church has a conference it can call home. And of course, the individual church disaffiliation, most notably the churches in our own annual conference undergoing that discernment period. The challenges in these include just what are they going to look like? We're kind of delving into legal and logistical consequences. However, these options are already permitted within the Book of Discipline as we have it, including disaffiliation now that it was passed at the called session. So that hurdle is cleared already, but there will be other logistical and legal consequences. What will it cost? What will that look like? Big unknowns there. So my sense of what to do is to prepare for as many options as possible at the same time, to be informed about, as I'm trying to do, and you can see the chart that I'm constantly updating on the Open Spirit Task Force. It's called Comparing Pathways, and there's a link to it in our resources that shows and highlights most of those major plans that we talk about and kick around a little bit. And then looking at the individual legislation, and I'm interested in supporting any legislation that will relatively quickly and with as much justice as possible create enough freedom within whatever systems we have that we can do our ministries faithfully, and we will not be hindering one another. I don't want to hinder my conservative colleagues and siblings in their ministry either. I just want the freedom and the liberation to do what God has called us to do. So how do we get there? Anything that moves us in that direction, I'm in favor of. Anything that gets in the way of that, I'm voting against. And then to work with, at the same time, the jurisdiction, other allies across the movement to be ready. Are we building a new denomination to be ready to invite ourselves into and one another into, etc. So that we're tracking that along and at the same time exploring disaffiliation, removal, withdrawal from the United Methodist Church as individual churches, or if possible, as a whole annual conference, because the annual conference is the body that owns property and is incorporated. And so Judicial Council did not rule on whether an annual conference can just disaffiliate as a whole. So that remains an open question. And then to strengthen and build capacity in the conference itself to resist injustice together. And I think a huge part of that is for every church, as Will was saying, to be asking these questions, having these conversations, building capacity about who we are as Methodists and in New England in 2020 and what we believe, what we want next. This slide is kind of a picture representation of that, trying to illustrate that we're planning across the board in multiple directions, because what happens, so we're planning for General Conference, planning for the jurisdictional conference, strengthening our annual conference, because when we get to General Conference in May, we have no idea what would happen. We could have some options for annual conference to disaffiliate, or different regions to have freedom. We're ready for that. We could find that an inclusive United Methodist Church is created or retained, and we're ready to just move into that. We could find what I think might be most likely, that no decision gets made, or it gets worse. And so we have strategies in place where we're ready to work with what we do have to find greater liberation. So that sense of playing, pushing in all directions at once. And then finally, I think, what can we do to be prepared in this time where we're praying, we're planning, and we're listening. We're having those conversations in local churches, much like the discerners are having, asking where God is calling us, being solid in our identity as Methodists, as United Methodists, or whatever we call ourselves next, knowing what our concerns are, talking to one another across the conference, and asking both as individual churches and as a conference how we equip one another for our ministry regionally and globally, so that we can continue to thrive and to do the work that God's called us to do. So then I borrow from both John Wesley and from my another beloved community that I know of, the recovery community, to learn all we can, prepare all we can, listen to each other all we can, and pray all we can, or as is often said in 12-step groups, let go and let God. And I think that's the best that we can do in the meantime. So thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists for just the wealth of information and wisdom that they have shared this evening. We actually have not had a lot of questions tonight, which I am so surprised by that. But I will, there have been a number of comments, and I'll just kind of like go in order of the panelists. Will, you had provided some clarification about the disaffiliation process in the chat, and I just wanted to see if you wanted to follow up on that and just present it to everyone, so everyone can kind of hear just some of the clarification that you provided.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah. When I think I typed this with Catherine's slide that related to churches that are already disaffiliating, and just wanted to say the reason churches in New England are not disaffiliating with the trust clause being suspended is because of that resolution 211, which says that churches in New England must go through an 8-month discernment process and have a number of other a few other restrictions also that we have to get, that have to happen. So, it's hard saying we can't do it yet, because it's, we can do whatever we want. Who knows what we can do? But as far as the rules of our annual conference and suspending or resolutions of our annual conference, but suspending the trust clause, our congregations, I don't think will be able to do that until we go through the 8-month process, also have the listening sessions, which need to be scheduled, first of all, and then also facilitated by district superintendents. and then also the communication with the conference bodies. Also want to say Erica wrote something very helpful in the chat box, reminding us that paragraph 2553 of the discipline, this new disaffiliation thing, says that any decision that a local church makes about disaffiliation gets brought to the annual conference, and the annual conference has to vote to affirm or to deny churches leaving the the denomination. So, you know, it's going to have to come before the annual conference for a church to disaffiliate. Whether, you know, who knows how that will play out or what that means, but that's a really important point, that it's not just the local church deciding on their own, but with the annual conference. Thanks.
Thanks, Will. A question for Catherine. You mentioned that some of the, I guess it was in the greater New Jersey area, they're engaging in these like covenant process or creating covenants. And one of the questions that was raised is, how is this different from the reconciling process?
Right. So the covenant process isn't just for churches that want to be involved in LGBT ministries or necessarily be open and affirming. It's an invitation for all churches to talk about how they feel called to be in ministry. In fact, I've got the quote about how they will be in ministry with God, one another, and the community as they seek to thrive serving God. So it's an invitation to talk about their ministry at this point in time and create a covenant. And for those congregations that want to move forward with ministry that affirms full participation of LGBT persons, that would be a part of the covenant, but it wouldn't necessarily be a part of the covenant for other churches. So it's just a process for congregations to enter into and to put in writing. And another interesting thing that I saw was, and again, I don't know how they'll do this because it contradicts all the new restrictions, but that the cabinet will take that covenant into account when they appoint a pastor. So if you say we're a church that wants a pastor, our covenant is that we will be in ministry for centering the voices of whatever LGBT persons, that a pastor in that with those same convictions would be appointed to that church. So that's as much as I know at this point.
Thank you, Catherine. One question that I want to pitch to Becca has to do with whether or not it is, if New England Annual Conference can actually afford to disaffiliate as an annual conference. Can we actually survive and thrive if that were the direction that we were to go in?
We're seeing this one on the chat right now as well, and an equally important question: can we afford not to? And I think both are both financially and theologically. I think the shortest answer is, of course, that we don't know. But the delegation did pose questions related to this to some representatives from WestPath. The biggest challenge ends up being questions around the pension, unfunded pension liabilities, and all of that calculation is proposed to change as well. You know, there's a whole bunch of stuff up in the air about that. I actually went on to the WestPath website yesterday or the day before, just out of curiosity, to check my own retirement account, and it has this big red thing at the top that says, this is like such a this is an estimate and everything's going to change at GC 2020. So do not bank on this. It's very comforting. But there's this question of what would be the New England Annual Conference's portion of the unfunded pension, etc., that we would essentially need to buy out in order to withdraw from the conference. This same calculation basically would be asked of any church withdrawing from the denomination as well, what it owes to the conference, to the denomination, etc. And we don't know the answers to those questions. WestPath says, we don't know the numbers, the figures, we can't calculate that for you. However, what they are proposing is basically that if large enough bodies, 50 churches and clergy or more, which is the definition of an annual conference, withdrew together, and that new expression also remained a client, a plan sponsor of WestPath, that remained essentially in the benefit pool and the liability pool, that would reduce the instability in the pool and would presumably mean that the buyout thing is less arduous. But you know, the big, huge, glaring capital letters on the top of my retirement plan and everybody else's is these are estimates and we don't know. So we have no idea what it would cost financially for the New England Conference to withdraw from the denomination, but we're seeing that our apportionments as a conference are already, our mission shares are down by well over $250,000. I think we're hearing from congregations loud and clear that that are, you know, we're voting no confidence in the denomination right now, whether that's a statement of conscience or a statement of we don't see the future for this denomination. I think we're seeing that pain and that ambiguity on that level too. So it may not be feasible that way either to remain a part of the denomination in that way.
Adama, may I say something?
Thanks, Becca. I actually have a series of questions, and I'm going to start off by kind of pitching it over to Catherine. The first question is, what kind of conversations or discussions are going on for individuals who are appointed beyond the local church? Like, say, for instance, someone who is a chaplain and being ordained is important for their credentialing and so forth. Do you know of any current discussions or conversations that are going on in terms of like what will happen, you know, should there be disaffiliation or some new expression of Methodism that's created going forward?
I haven't seen or heard any of that. It may well be happening and I may not be aware of it. I wouldn't be surprised if those conversations aren't happening yet, just because you tend to affiliate with a body. I mean, I spent years in extension ministry appointments and, you know, affiliated with the annual conference at that point. So I don't know until it's clear what bodies are going to exist, whether you can go the next step of talking about where chaplains and other extension ministers would affiliate. But I can see why it's nervous making for those that are in that position.
Thank you. And there was a series of questions that were raised, and I'm gonna pitch this to either Catherine or even maybe Becca might want to chime in, or Will, if you're aware of any suggestions here. But the question is, what options might be available for those who are serving in contexts with significant theological differences from their own, serving in contexts where people are deeply divided, or serving in context in which people are unsure or are in many different places on the questions before the UMC?
Yeah.
I-
Yeah, do you want to go ahead, Will?
I was going to say that's the United Methodist Church.
I was
That's
going to say, that was exactly what I was going to say. That's most of our congregations.
yeah, that's the general idea behind it. So
Yeah, that's most of our congregations, which is why it's so glaring that conversations have not happened. You know, as much as, for example, Commission on Religion and Race for the last several years has put out wonderful resources and videos and things for conversation starters and all that about race. My guess is that, similar to questions around gender identity and all that, those conversations, they're hard at the local level. It'll be really interesting to see whether the New Jersey example, whether they're successful. It really struck me when they said they were going to train and offer outside facilitators. That, you know, to have somebody come into your church and say, we'll help with this conversation. So it's not the pastor or a member of the church. I don't know. But But yeah, that's most of our churches right there.
And what I wanted to add that I think one possibility that we could think about, especially if the denomination ends up in more than one resulting denomination, and there are churches that are divided, which denomination do we want to be a part of? Our congregation has people who lean in more than one direction. Is that we have models for churches that are federated with two or more different denominations, really different denominations in some cases, and part of the membership roll is Methodist and part is UCC. So why not have part be more conservative or traditionalist and part be more centrist, or part be liberationist? It's working together in the congregation, and use bylaws. And in those cases, there are ways that, written into the agreements for those churches about how the appointments of clergy are handled, alternating between the different denominations, for example, or all sorts of different ways that kind of allow a congregation to have the DNA it has, and continue as a beloved community together. So I think there's some possibility for congregations to live in tension as they have done all along, and for clergy and congregations to live in tension as we collectively have done all along, and just kind of keep being the church, as my colleagues have said.
Another question for you, Becca. What is the role of the WCA in New England, and will they act as the policing entity on January 1st, 2020?
Sure. I have had some conversations, but I keep seeing Will trying to jump in, so I want to check first with you.
Yeah,
Will.
I'm in the WCA. I can answer. No, just kidding. Just kidding. No, I wanted to say just three things. First, that important question about congregations that are divided and in a division otherwise. I just want to say that the discernment model is for churches that feel that they're not sure, that they're clear on where they are in terms of liberation and justice and oppression, and are ready to act. So it's not an answer. So the question is a good one, but sometimes people have asked us as the discerning churches, they say, well, my church isn't quite there, and we don't all agree. Then this isn't the right. Then discerning to leave isn't so much where you are. So there's other work to happen. But I want to say two other things on the finance piece about can the annual conference afford leave, just how that relates to local churches in the discernment process. The first thing, this is a sensitivity thing, but I just want to be clear that churches that are in the discernment process have not decided that they're withholding mission shares. So I don't want anyone to be confused that discerning churches have. My church pays 100% of our mission shares for many years, and we will this year. Maybe I'm not saying we will forever, but I just want to be clear that it being in the discernment process does not mean that we're not paying mission shares. Because I know sometimes that gets confusing when people say, well, some churches are sick of this and trying to move. So that's and the second thing I want to say is that finances will not be the final decision in whether or not our congregations stay United Methodist. In other words, if we go through a prayerful 8-month educational discernment process and decide we need to leave, and the response comes back, it'll be $3 million, then we're going to figure out a way to leave. So this will not come down. And that's why in our 8-month process, we've put the financial question late. It's like session 6 out of 8 that we're going to talk about it. Because obviously, the impulse is to let that shape and guide the conversation. It's important, but we're going to try to make that cost as low as possible and work on that. But this is not going to come down to, if we can't afford it, we'll stay United Methodist, because we don't have enough money. So we're going to stay. That's not how the decision is going to be made in the end. Thanks.
And I would hope the same for our annual conference. If that was the direction the whole annual conference is going, that would be a similar, we figure out how. So the question about the role of the WCA in New England, and I have had some conversation, as you can probably see from the membership of the Open Spirit Task Force, is a diverse group and does intentionally include voices from the WCA as part of those conversations. We serve side by side. I have a colleague that I've served for years with alongside on the Board of Ordained Ministry. And we ask really similar questions. You know, I mean, we're actually not that different in our rigorous examination of, we want there to be excellent clergy in our conference. And these people have looked me in the face and said, no one in our annual conference has any interest in bringing complaints or charges against anyone in our annual conference for being LGBTQ or for officiating at same-sex or same-gender weddings. We just, like, that's not going to get any play in New England. That's not what we're here to do. We want to be able to live our biblically faithful witness and be church the way we feel called to be, but we're not here to bring complaints. The people that have said that to me because of relationship I have with them, I do believe them. That said, and as Effie is saying in the chat room, we have no control and we have no relationship with people outside the annual conference. A complaint can be brought by anyone, anywhere in the connection. So that fear, I think, is real and is warranted. And the question then becomes, how would the people within our annual conference respond to a complaint? How, you know, who's going to be the counsel for the church? Who's going to work on the committee on investigation and so forth? How are those people covenanting to respond and to act together? And what can we do to strengthen the justice in the system and the response there? I was having conversation today, and I said to someone, I don't have faith in the justice in our judicial process when it comes to this any longer, certainly not starting January 1st. So what are we doing to protect one another within our annual conference from an outside threat? And I've had conversations with Bishop Devidar as well about how he would be inclined to respond and his desire to protect people, but to be accountable to the process as he understands it, and to be accountable as the pastor of this conference to the annual conference as a whole. So yeah, I'm not really terribly scared about people within our conference, but there's threat out there, and so we need to be really strong in supporting one another as a conference, and our responses to this.
Becca, I was going to type it, but and back to Catherine's earlier point, I appreciate the questions was formed in terms of, is the WCA going to do this? It's not really a WCA thing anymore. This is the discipline of the United Methodist Church we're talking about. So, you know, it's not a WCA might do this to us. It's like, this is us, as Catherine said. And it might not be helpful, but I think it's worth, I think it's worth it saying.
Thank you. Someone had raised a question regarding the African bishops and whether or not they have agreed to modify their position at General Conference 2020 due to financial pressure on Africa University, which I guess is not expected to get the necessary or needed funds that they need to operate. And someone just raised a question as if, can someone confirm whether that is the case or not? If anybody on the panel would like to take a stab at that question.
What most reports are saying is that delegates and bishops from Africa are unwilling to bend on the theological position. I did see one report this week that that some delegates or bishops from Africa had come out in support of the U.S. Central Conference idea. But that again, if we can only amend some parts of the Book of Discipline, that's not going to get enough in the freedom in the system. But there's been some really vociferous. We will not allow the church to schism or to come apart or to form new denominations, and we will not allow any wiggle room for greater inclusion, let alone justice for queer folks. So not sure how that's going to work out.
There you have it.
And I see there was one last question that I see regarding whether or not there are resources for congregations who are wanting to or need to have some difficult conversations around what's going on currently in United Methodist Church. I could say that as part of the Open Spirit Task Force, and I see that one of the task force members responded in the chat that we are working on resources that will be, that we hope to make available and that we hope to share on the website and to really publicize the availability of those resources. So I'd say just bear with us a little bit longer here, and we're trying to make those available as soon as we possibly can. I don't see any other additional or comments or questions that were raised. I just want to open it up to the panelists again to share any final comments with everyone.
I want to reiterate, I know I did it strongly once, but to encourage people to Google that Daryl Stevens presentation. It just gives a perspective, and what's making me think of it again is talking about the global church. Gives a perspective on the imperialism of the United Methodist Church that I think is very helpful. So I would encourage people to watch that. It's only 15 minutes, 14 minutes and some seconds.
Will, Becca, any comments, parting comments?
Just in terms of how to have difficult conversations, just I hope people have read Raising White Kids by Jennifer Harvey, published by Abingdon Press, which is fantastic. And I hope people have read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's the Bible. There's so many resources about having difficult conversations that I hope we're working on this a lot.
Yeah. To amplify a note from the comments that the traditionalist plan was not an African plan. It was a plan devised and developed by white people. The traditionalist plan is colonialism and imperialism in its most egregious forms, at least in my opinion. I'll just kind of say that. And you're welcome, Effie, but they're your words, so these are Effie's words that I'm amplifying, so not my ideas to make sure that is named. And I think you're hearing us speaking with one voice to the importance of really examining the role that white supremacy and colonialism have played in bringing the United Methodist Church to where it is. And I think this is an opportunity for us to deal a blow to white supremacy. And it might be that the United Methodist Church, as we know it, is a victim of that, but that might be a good thing as this expression of our tradition dies into new life, that this could be a wonderful opportunity. I'm so blessed by, heartened by, excited by the power in all of these movements into something more just and liberative. So this is the church. God's not done with us, but we have work to do, and white folk especially, we have our own work to do to try to mitigate some of the harm that we and our ancestors have caused. So to be really clear about that, because of how Africa gets used as a monolithic pawn, boogeyman in this conversation, and that is just not the case.
Well, we are actually out of time, and I want to just thank everyone, all the panelists for joining us and for sharing again their wisdom and information. I also want to remind people that the PowerPoint slides, as well as this actual town hall recording, will be available on the Open Spirit Task Force website, which is currently on the screen. If you have any questions for the task force, feel free to email us at openspiritne@mail.com. Again, it's been a pleasure. And I also want to give a shout out to one of my lay siblings, Richard Morris. He did a phenomenal job of putting together all of these PowerPoint slides. He was so gracious with his time and with his effort. So Richard, if you're watching, thank you so much. I appreciate you. And again, thanks to everyone, and hope to see you all back here in the spring for another town hall. Thank you all so much.
We have one more.
Oh, one more thing. I'm going to unmute everybody in a second, and then we will invite you all to shout out words of gratitude, hope, and praise. So have at it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Blessings, church.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Great presentation.
Good job.
Take the paper off first.
Oh, take it off.
Stop the recording.